today about some trends as we exit 2023. Take notice of some of the actions and comments from regulators and governments, both here and abroad. Revisit what the modern data landscape looks like, at least briefly. And then take a look at 2024. And of course, everybody has to have a top 10 predictions as we head into the new year. And look at the impact of what those predictions are and what it means for each of us and what it means for you. So as we exit 2023, I wanted to hit just a couple of what I thought were macro trends. The first, we'd be remiss if we didn't start and talk about AI, and AI goes mainstream in 2023. You can't turn on the TV, you can't read an article online, can't watch a news program without some discussion of AI. And it really is not just a topic, though, from a public perspective, but every enterprise that we talk with, and almost every enterprise I'm sure that you work with, AI and machine learning is a conversation that's being had at all levels in the organization. And a lot of it's been driven by really the capabilities and capacity of the compute and technology infrastructure that's available that allows us to create, consume, and collect enormous volumes of data. With that, anytime you see an action like that and such a significant impact by a technology or anything else, governments tend to find a way to invite themselves to the party. And so we've seen some early indications of how the government, at least governments, are looking at the challenges and the opportunities associated with AI, and what they may, what the future portends potentially, and where they may look to act in the future. What we also found is that, and you'll see in some of the survey data that I've got in here, that the data turns out to be a significant part of the compliance and risk management function more broadly. And even though we think of compliance or risk management potentially is not necessarily always associated with data, so much of what we do today is really focused on data and the need for data to both manage and understand the risks and the compliance obligations that we have. Finally, cybersecurity continues to be a major concern, both from an enterprise perspective, but also government perspective. Cybersecurity and resiliency requirements have been driving different regulatory frameworks and data sovereignty globally, and you'll see some examples that I have in the content. So what is, everybody knows obviously the AI stories that are out there, but I thought I'd spend a little bit of time talking about where the AI in government is starting to fit. So the first thing is the idea that the governments are going to come out with some sort of legal or regulatory framework that really controls AI, I think is unlikely. And it's only because it is moving so quickly, it's so complicated, that it's really going to move too fast and too quickly for most organizations, for any government really to get their head around, at least in a way to promulgate something quickly that seeks to take control of AI to the extent that they even could. So I do have some frameworks and proposals around responsible AI that have been produced and promulgated by Australia, the UK, and US as examples. And although we're not going to see necessarily immediate regulatory or legal language, one of the things that we actually have seen are some actions that give an indication where the government might be able to take some steps. The EU, unsurprisingly, has taken some of the first steps around AI, and they've done so really through the province of privacy policies and privacy issues. The EU Data Protection Board, basically the board that's behind or whatever is the enforcement mechanism around GDPR, they launched a dedicated task force this year to coordinate potential enforcement actions against ChatGPT. And I've got a reference here for you. And interestingly, Italy briefly actually banned ChatGPT until they made changes that addressed what they had on their books around youth interaction issues and basically the kinds of content that might come back to individuals or underage individuals using ChatGPT. Now, another piece of this that's come out, and I don't have it in the papers. If somebody wants it, they can shoot me a note. But the CFPB, the Consumer Finance Protection Board, earlier this year had also issued a letter basically stating that under their read, the CFPB maintains sufficient authority as it exists today to go after or to enforce the regulations around various consumer finance regulations. And it's around if a person were to have made a decision that somehow resulted in an improper action, discrimination, and instead we just insert technology that does the same thing, whether it be a robot or not, the enforcement mechanisms around that are still there. And so their perception, and the perception I think that many regulators will start to take in the future, is, insert robot where we used to have human. And if human or person made an action, took an action, failed to take an action, and instead we've inserted technology in that loop instead, the regulators are likely to say it doesn't matter if it's a person or a thing, a robot, we still have a mechanism to seek redress. So I have here a chart that came out of the KPMG Risk Management Survey they conducted recently, and it was looking at risk officers globally. And they were looking at what this part of the survey was effectively of all the different things that you as a risk management professional are worried about across an organization, what is it that has the highest priority or concern? And so obviously the challenges around regulatory changes and compliance issues remain number one. But I thought was really interesting on this survey, especially given the macro environment that we all operate in, that cybersecurity issues is number two. This is something that actually beats out recession, the other macro things that are out there, tech disruptions, market risk, and that's really kind of fascinating. But it gives you a sense for how critical data is to an organization, and how critical it is that we as compliance professionals have to think about it from a risk perspective as well, and all the things and all of the affirmative obligations we have to actually secure and protect and manage this data, because obviously cybersecurity remains such a hot, not just a hot topic, but such a real risk for the organizations that we work with. So one of the other things that was somewhat consistent across a number of jurisdictions globally this last year were regulations that required organizations to look at how they provide protection and resiliency against a range of risks. Some of this had to do with some of the data sovereignty laws and statute and regulations that came out, and some of this had to do with specific resiliency concerns. But they're all really related, which is the governments were concerned, or the governments are concerned, not just with the national security of information, but rather the national interest in having corporations and enterprises and organizations have the ability to be resilient, protect data, keep data in country that's critical to the operation of enterprises, critical to the nation as a whole, protecting data around privacy, and then understanding the data that you're managing that creates risk to third parties as well, or if you're a third party. And then very consistently as well, and I've got some references in here, a consistent reference to this need to maintain integrity and availability of records or critical data. And it's noted in these, right, and this is not novel either, that the government imposes these obligations on us and regulators to preserve data, often for them to come back and be able to obviously verify that an organization has operated consistent with whatever practices it is, or to the extent that there's an investigation, that the government has the ability to inspect and review that data. And so data integrity, availability of this information, and protection of that data is, again, not just for resiliency, it turns out, but also this need for governments to be able to come after and review that data. A lot of this, as I mentioned, around the data sovereignty piece, it's protecting the data to make sure that these corporations or enterprises can operate as well. But again, it's part of this is protecting the citizens and the concern that this data, especially privacy-related data, is not exposed in ways that are unnecessary. And we can talk at some other length if somebody has questions. We can talk about the fallout from Schrems 2 still that's out there. So if you take the next step in this risk management survey that KPMG did, so it's okay. So we understand the risk, we understand the risks, we understand the priority of these risks. So what is it? What kind of tools or technologies can we use to accelerate and improve our risk management processes? And AI and ML is number one on the list, which is going to be interesting. We have to use AI and ML in legal and regulatory and compliance fields, and we have for some time, but just the sheer volume and scale of information that's going to be generated now without some sort of AI or ML and other technologies obviously will make that very difficult. The reason I have number 2 highlighted is that I thought it was really fascinating. Again, of all the other things that you could do as a risk manager, data storage and storage of data is so high on the list. And it's because if you actually read through this and you understand the background, a lot of the ransomware attacks and cyber attacks is actually data that is in legacy systems and in on-prem environments that aren't leveraging the latest cloud technologies and latest infrastructure. And it's that reason that creates this risk. And so all of a sudden, something that seems very IT-centric, very pedestrian almost, like how do you manage and keep these files and access this data, becomes such an interest to risk officers. And we see that actually as well, which is how do you now start to make this information available to AI and ML and other tools, but do so in a way, and to people, but do so in a way that really protects the environments and then provides trusted access to that data. So I wanted to take a diversion into what I call the ephemeral and the uncontrolled business data world just for a minute, because this was one of the other trends that really came out of 2023. I mean, you could go back really to 2021 when a lot of this started, but the US DOJ's guidance, I think, kind of put an exclamation point on it this year. So many of you in the financial services world will be familiar with significant fines that were issued in that industry as it pertained to the use of third-party, uncontrolled communication applications, so Signal, Telegram, WhatsApp, by members of primarily broker-dealers and also CFTC-regulated entities, both here and abroad, but mostly here in the U.S. And to date, there's approximately $2 billion worth of fines that have been issued. And I use that as an example also to say that, if in a very highly controlled environment or regulated industry, you still had that kind of use of third-party technologies that were off-channel and uncontrolled, most other enterprises have at least that same problem. Now, they don't have the same regulatory potential hit as far as the books and records requirements might not be as strict, and the supervision requirements aren't. But it represents a different kind of risk, right, that you have uncontrolled information, uncontrolled access out there. And it was enough for the U.S. DOJ and their guidance on evaluation of compliance programs that was promulgated earlier this year to really present in this a discussion around, hey, if you have and know of use of uncontrolled applications, or you're not providing the frameworks and the technologies and the practices and the policies to maintain information and control the data, if that's going to have an impact on the maintenance of your business records or other risks, that's something that they'll contemplate or they'll consider in the evaluation of your program to the extent that you ever ran into an issue. Because I talk about this with international clients, I had run into a specific directorate from Australia's Signal Directorate, which is or a note from Australia's Signal Directorate. It's basically the equivalent of our NSA. And they even took the time to say, look, there's a lot of risk associated with private devices accessing these corporate systems that the nation, in this case, in Australia's case, relies on. They rely on, many people rely on these enterprises and organizations for the Australian, society to function, governments to work, enterprises to work, the economy to work. And that was enough of a risk for them to note. And so I just always remind enterprises and organizations I work with that to really think about, are you providing enough tools and platforms and policies for people to actually govern the data that's appropriate, but still be able to execute and do the work that they're being asked to do. If you've attended a couple of my other webcasts, I'm going to have 2 or 3 slides in here you may have seen before, but I like to share them because not everybody's seen them before, and they're worth revisiting. This is what I call a modern data landscape. This is just showing you the growth in data over the next several years, and it continues to go up. This is a diagram or a chart you probably could have shown any number of times, and it would look something like this. The important piece to really show here is that the growth in unstructured data is going to continue to go up. Right now, JP Morgan's estimated something like 1,000 exabytes of on-prem unstructured data sitting in old NAS environments, and that's data that's going to have to move out. That goes back to the risk management chart that I showed you before. That's a lot of data that's sitting there that's potentially at risk. AI, a lot of the content that's going to be created by AI is going to be unstructured. And you just think about the generative AI use cases, most of them are outputting something that is very much more in an unstructured form than a structured form. But in a way, as you'll see in a minute, it starts to break down the pattern of structured or unstructured, starts to become less important simply because the platforms and the technologies that we're using are able to create and consume across that spectrum. So like to look at this sometimes instead of this binary, hey, data is structured or it's unstructured, or it sits in a file somewhere, or it sits in some database. It's really this range or this continuum of data, and it's everything from modern communications, electronic communications, to files. And then you start to get into these different forms of data where you have data that's in semi-structured or structured forms sitting in an application in some denormalized database. Maybe there's files associated with it. Maybe there's legacy data, legacy systems I want to decommission. And really, you have to think about how do you get all of this data into different platforms or into common platforms to manage the governance around them without trying to treat each one of these basically as its own silo, right? So you don't want systems or solutions that are specific to a form of data, because again, you have this range of data now, and the systems are going to be creating a lot of these ranges of data. So you need stuff that can work across and not just within one of these silos. And you have to do it because for any given piece of data or for any given set of data, there's a series of affirmative obligations that are typically associated with it, right? You don't have a piece or set of data that just has security requirements, or just has privacy, or just has data sovereignty or retention. Typically, now, again, most of this data has any number of these, and often many or most of these obligations associated with it. And so instead of using many different applications and many different platforms to try and deal with all of these, and you'll have to, I mean, you're going to have more than one for sure, but you're going to want to try and get, again, platforms and solutions that can deal with many of these obligations instead of trying to treat these all separately. So before we get into 2024 in too much detail, the one other thing I wanted to point out from 2023 was the M&A market for governance, risk, and compliance technologies. Now, you may say, well, why do I care as a compliance professional necessarily about M&A in the GRC market? Well, it gives you a pretty good sense, actually, for not just where people are willing to invest, but why, right? So uh, it's you see the money flowing here and the deal flow and the average um, transaction cost or the average transaction price going up because of the perceived value, but also the perceived need, right? If this was an area that we don't see continued growth and need in, you wouldn't see this kind of M&A activity, and you wouldn't see both the deal flow and the transaction prices going up the way they are. So companies, obviously, and enterprises are seeing real value in these solutions. That's driving up their value and real need, and that's really what you should take away from this. And it also aligns with the complexity and the growth and regulations around data as well, right? So it's not just data's growing and the data volumes are growing, but the things you have to do around it to govern it, to protect it, and all the regulatory frameworks around it are going up as well, and that's why you see this. Okay, so let me talk for a second then about 2024 and what they mean for compliance protections and what they mean for compliance and records professionals. I probably could have come up with a list of 20 or 30, and I did originally, but I tried to reduce this to the 10 that I thought would be the most relevant and the most interesting, and hopefully what I think are going to have the highest impact. So the first is AI models training and decisions become a new class of business records. So if you think about AI and ML, you really need to think about really three buckets with them. You have to think about the data that they work on, that they're trained on, the model that's either used or created based on the training, and then finally the output. And that output might be a piece of content, and that piece of content, of course, could be a record that would be subject to any retention requirement you already have. But that output could be a decision, right? That output could be an analysis that says, we should invest in this or not, or this is someone that we want to give credit to or we don't want to give credit to, or this one poses this particular transaction poses a risk, and we're going to increase the collateral requirements. Whatever it might be, the decisions then that are created around that are going to likely need to be preserved in some way, shape, or form. Somehow the organization over time is going to be able to define the decision tree or track that flowed through, the technology flowed through, and that decision cycle flowed through, and understand what was ultimately decided. Because at some point you are going to have a regulatory investigation or a piece of litigation that says, hey, I was discriminated against, or you're failing to conform to whatever requirements that you have, and you have to explain all of it. And if you can't, if it's truly a black box and people don't have even the basic understanding for how this is working, then it's going to be a challenge for you long term. So, anyways, I think look for the fact that these AI and ML models training the decisions are going to be some form of business record, whether they become more explicit than that this year, we'll see, but I think you'll see them that certainly emerge. You'll definitely see the first enforcement actions based on AI and ML performance. Like I said, you've already seen a little bit, at least an indication or hint out of the EU. They're going to probably push that on the privacy side for sure first. In the U.S., I mentioned the U.S. Consumer Finance Protection Bureau had already published a letter in 2023 saying, hey, we've already got sufficient authority to look at how and what decisions you're making around consumer finance, and if if the robot is making decisions that would be inconsistent with your obligations just as a human, then you're going to have an issue. So the other thing is that governments globally are under increased pressure to control AI and ML, and that's always true, right? I recall working in the through the credit crisis and post-credit crisis, and just the amount of pressure that the regulators were under to demonstrate that they were not just obviously on the enforcement side, but then coming up with and promulgating new rules and regulations to try and obviously prevent something like that from happening again, but show that they were taking action, they were doing something. That is going to be a very strong force that's going to be pushing the regulators and governments. Ironically, I think what's going to happen is that governments themselves are going to be slow to adopt generative AI for a couple of reasons. One, there's this concern that they have, an inability or lack of control over what AI may do. The other thing is that AI is very limited in its ability to work with legacy records and archival systems, at least the legacy forms of them. And so much of the information that the government has is in systems that were custom made years ago, custom developed, built by a large team of SIs for a very specific purpose that definitely we're not thinking about, hey, how do I entitle and make this data available to AI and ML solutions 5 years from now or 3 years from now, which 3 or 5 years ago. And so that's a big piece, an inhibitor as well. So a lot of the government is getting their data into modern platforms in order for them to really take advantage of AI and ML. Interestingly, the government is starting to adopt, here in the US anyways, and governments elsewhere are starting to adopt cloud and commercial platforms, right? You see the US Department of Defense moving to M365 for their messaging and for some of their collaboration. A few years ago, nobody would ever said that the US government, the DoD, would do something like that. Overseas, we also see adoption of cloud technologies, and even to the point where you have countries that are otherwise too small to have the hyperscalers bring large data centers in, investing alongside the hyperscalers to bring them in, just so that they have that availability of the technology in their country. So data rationalization and consolidation for good governance. This is a little bit, some of this is a little bit inside baseball, but it's important. So you have to think about how rapidly data has expanded over the last 5 years, and the sharing and the amount of data that's happening across enterprises was really good. It opened up all kinds of span of control, the ability to work across teams and globally is critical. But at the same time, that rapid expansion, especially with the different collaboration systems out there, meant data was moving in all kinds of directions, up, down, out. Third-party risk was proliferating as well. And I think you'll start to see organizations try and get a little bit of control over the number of sources of data, and certainly the number of sources of data that contain critical information or information that's highly sensitive in particular. This is also going to get into the third-party realm as well, and again, a little bit of this gets into some of the resiliency requirements that are going to be coming out of in the EU, and some that will continue to evolve here in the US. Obviously, we have a lot of third-party risk management requirements under various security regimes anyways, and that will just continue to evolve. Accelerated migration of the on-prem data to secure cloud environments. So I'd spoken about this before a little bit, where JP Morgan had this estimate about this huge volume of data that's sitting in unstructured data sitting in on-prem environments that need to move. And the CRO survey that I mentioned highlighted it. It's really pretty critical as well if you look at the amount of data in these legacy systems, where these systems cannot be maintained or updated. The authentication systems don't even work. You don't have multi-factor. You can't patch them anymore. They don't receive the latest security requirements. They're hard to monitor with the latest monitoring tools. So that's an area where you're going to see this migration of on-prem systems and legacy systems into cloud environments. And as I mentioned, the enterprises and governments, so governments are investing alongside hyperscalers to bring these capabilities to environments where they otherwise wouldn't go. I'm thinking the Middle East in particular, where you see the hyperscalers having investments by countries in the region. But the other important point to make here is that the amount of data, the amount of money that enterprises spend and governments spend on their on-prem tech infrastructure that they create on their own is still a fraction of what the hyperscalers are doing from a security perspective and an infrastructure perspective. And so the ability to take and leverage what the hyperscalers have been creating, or the big, large, other SaaS providers have created in security and in capabilities, is something that really organizations generally will find that they benefit from, as opposed to a few years ago when everybody was still kind of poking around saying, well, maybe it's better if I keep everything on-prem. We'll continue to see different cyber resiliency requirements codified in regulations and statutes enforced in practice, and that's going to be the difference. So we've seen the kind of the beginnings of this, the regulations coming out, getting codified. I'm thinking of DORA in the EU. Here in the U.S., we've got the unclassified controlled confidential unclassified information, CUI. That was another set of data that's basically defined by the federal government as not necessarily subject to classification schemes that we would think of, secret, top secret, but rather these are sets of data that need to stay and be in country, and then resiliency requirements around them. And then organizations now, again, under things like the DFS in the financial services world and all the different cybersecurity requirements for organizations still mean that we have to protect that information and have the business records available and protect it as well. And data sovereignty requirements continue across the jurisdictions for the reasons I just explained as well. Data classification in a different way as opposed to classified data, so classified, top secret or a secret, but rather what sets of data I'm working with and what sets or types of data are subject to these requirements and that need to stay in country. And so the systems that you're working with have to be able to discern and manage information based on the classes of their data, so that hey, if it's this class of data, it needs to be retained in this way, in this form, and in this country, and in these environments, in these systems. And a lot of people right now it's a very challenging thing to be able to even know exactly where the classes of data that they have to manage in this way are created, consumed, and shared. And again, add your third parties in, and it becomes very complex. But that's really a predicate to deal with all the data sovereignty requirements that will continue to evolve. And then try to lay out just kind of at a practical level some of the things that you should be thinking about. So I mentioned previously the need to do some consolidation of the technology and the environments and data. And in particular, this gets to retirement of these legacy systems and retiring data out of operational and legacy systems when the data is no longer necessary there. We speak sometimes of a curve, which is the value of data decreases over time. And that's just true almost for any set of information. Think the design of an iPhone 1 versus an iPhone, whatever is going to come up here, 15. Anything that's more recent is obviously of higher value than something that's older. And that's true for almost all the data that you work with in an organization. At the same time, the risk goes up over time. The risk of information sitting in a place that people forget about, too many people have access to, or in environments and systems where you cannot maintain and manage them effectively anymore. They just don't have the same security and controls as we've discussed. That means that the risk curve intersects at some point with the value curve, and at that point, that's when you want the data out of those systems and into dedicated platforms for long-term management and governance. It doesn't mean that that data becomes unavailable to things like AI or analytics. In fact, you can now bring new sets of data that you had probably not been able to expose to an AI or analytics tool before, but they're in a much more governed, much more restricted, entitled, trusted way. And so that's a big part. We're certainly seeing it. Companies are trying to find ways to retire both the data and/or systems, and that's I think healthy for everybody. The use of the ephemeral messaging and off-channel comms becomes broader compliance and records issue. Like I said when I introduced this topic, when you think about these heavily regulated companies that had well-trained, very intelligent, knowledgeable, experienced professionals who nonetheless were working off-channel, there's almost no question that every other enterprise has this issue as well. And it's not so much a matter of, hey, they're just working off-channel and they're setting up meetings and they're making lunch dates or whatever it might be. It's, are they accessing or are they receiving or talking about critical business issues, right? Are they sharing privacy-related information, deal information? All of that is now outside of your control, and it just creates not just a risk of data spilling out that you don't want, whether it be pricing information, confidential information, or privacy-related, but at the end of the day, you're losing control of business records. Right, you have information that likely is subject to some sort of requirement to maintain that record, and you've probably lost control of it, or you have to go chase it down at some point in the future. So it's not an easy answer. I don't have an answer that will solve it for you immediately, other than to say you got to start picking at it, because it's only going to become more challenging as people again find new and more novel ways of sharing and consuming information. And the final is this is something you may or may not have had contact with, but you're likely to hear about if you haven't. And it's this concept of managing data in place. It's not a new concept. This concept goes back 10, 15 years. And the idea is that you can manage data in the source systems as opposed to moving it sometimes into dedicated environments for long-term preservation or governance, for e-discovery, whatever it might be. And at some level, it's true today, in the sense that the systems are much more capable than they were 10 years ago. I mean, 10, 15 years ago, source systems didn't have indexing. Source systems had very few controls for preservation and collection. Most source systems now of any decent type have some level of control, some level of indexing for search, some level of governance around active data. But none of them, or very few of them, are really designed to do it at scale and to do it over years and years, which is what we often are and I've worked with, obviously, throughout my career, data that has to live for a long time, years, not through next month, not for the next 3 months, but the next 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, and to do it at scale. And we're already seeing, and I've done advisory work before I joined this firm, already seeing where clients are challenged in the environments where companies are saying, hey, you can do it all here now. You don't have to do anything else. We'll just manage it all here in place. And what ends up happening is now you've got 30 disparate systems, 50 disparate systems, each with its own way in how it indexes technology, indexes data, what governance and retention controls you have, what disposition controls you have, what security and entitlements. You have so many different systems all saying you can do these things in them, but they all look very different, and a lot of them won't scale. So I just put this in here, 2.0, Managed in Place 2.0 will visit the similar issues of 1.0. We're already seeing it, maybe not the same level again, because technologies really definitely have improved. Add on top of this, the AI and analytics suites, they're amazing at what they do. Most are not designed for long-term management, compliance, governance, and e-discovery as well. So you got to think through that as well. And look what you can manage in place, but realize a lot of that still needs probably a long-term home, somewhere to go. So with that, I will open up for questions. I have my contact information here. Anybody at any time is welcome to contact me. I've got sources to the extent that they're not in this deck, and if somebody wants to see the source, let me know, or if you have questions, I'm happy to ask them. So got a question about what is new about third-party risk management. So the primary thing that's new about third-party risk management is if you look at, and I'm thinking in particular of DORA, which is Digital Operational Resiliency Act, and that's in the EU. What it's imposing is really for you to look across the portfolio of solution providers you have, and it's not just a technology risk assessment, do a privacy impact assessment, do a, look at their security and controls. It's really the risk around that third party, right? What would happen if you lost the ability of that third party to operate? Or what if you lost the ability to actually operate because a third party was unable or unwilling to execute some sort of function that you had? And that was one of the things that was a little bit different, in part also because it's a very prescriptive regulation that was published. And it was published, I think, again, because governments are very concerned about the ability of enterprises to operate in a very complicated and potentially very dangerous world that we live in.
Okay, George, thanks for that presentation, and I will wrap up the webcast here, but I'll also, if there are any other questions, I will ask them to George before we wrap up here. Just another housekeeping item here. If you'd like to get a copy of the slides that were just presented, you can download them from the drop-down menu on the bottom left-hand side of your screen. Okay, so let's go to the Q&A and see if there are any other questions. I have one here. You mentioned that regulators already feel they have authority over decisions generated by AI and ML. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, I'm sorry, say that one again. I just missed that.
Yeah, the question was, you mentioned regulators already feel they have authority over decisions generated by AI and ML. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, the CFPB was one who issued that one letter, and other regulators have come out as well, and basically said that, whatever authority we have to govern the conduct or the actions or the practices of your business as it was run by people, to the extent that it's going to be an AI or a robot or a piece of technology that is now in the middle of that, we're going to have basically the same authority. So just because it's AI or ML doesn't absolve you of whatever the other obligations were that you had before.
Okay, good. We have a follow-up question to the TPRM question was how do you manage this if they refuse to execute their functions? I'm assuming they're talking about whether the third parties refuse. Yeah,
right. Well, it's interesting because we were having a conversation about this when I was in London with somebody who's in a large enterprise. And at that point, you have two choices, right? You try to find a way to mitigate the risk by having somebody else be able to fill that role, and this is a real challenge because some of the smaller, it's not the tier 1 suppliers they were worried about. It was the tier 2, tier 3, suppliers that they were worried about that didn't have the ability to provide all the different things that they would be looking for. And it is too bad because at that point, as an organization, you may be at a point where you say, look, if you can't do this, we can't do business with you, which is unfortunate. But that's the potential risk that the smaller firms are going to live with, and then the bigger ones, they're going to have to potentially do work with larger companies instead of having some of the smaller firms that they like to work with.
Right. Okay. I think we have time for one more question here. What kind of role do you see compliance/legal teams picking up in AI use cases across the enterprise?
Yeah. So a couple. The first ones for compliance and legal teams, we've been using it. We've been using machine learning actually at some level for almost going back 7, 8, 9 years in legal. It's been more limited for sure, right? But it's in the analysis of data or the building a model to look at specific things, communication channel content, looking at from a case perspective, looking at different matters and leveraging models and machine learning within them, active learning technologies. But now I think when you look at the generative AI capabilities, you're actually going to see how you can look across many different platforms and many different areas of risk that you already are modeling, and actually come up with some pretty comprehensive models that allow you to consume data from all these different sources in different ways that you weren't able to before.
Great, thanks. So I think we're going to end the Q&A here, and then I'll wrap up the webcast. Again, I want to thank everyone for listening today. I'd like to thank our speaker, George Tsahanas, and I'd also like to thank Archive 360 for making this webcast possible. To obtain your CPE credit for this presentation, please disable your pop-up blockers to ensure access to the exam. The webcast will close automatically, and the final examination will be presented in a separate window. If you have trouble viewing the CPE test or receiving the CPE certificate, please send an email to webcasts@complianceweek.com. Compliance Week is now offering training courses designed for compliance, risk, and audit professionals that offer a chance to enhance one's expertise in key compliance areas while earning continuing legal education and continued professional education credits. We offer virtual classroom trainings, self-studies, and customized trainings. Please see complianceweek.com/training to learn more. This webcast has been recorded and will be available later today to Compliance Week members on our website under the Webcast tab, which also contains a library of additional CPE webcasts. If you'd like to learn more about becoming a member, please contact us at info@complianceweek.com. As a member, you receive full access to tools and resources, discounts to conferences, and to our editorial coverage, including the stories linked in the slide deck related to the topics discussed during this presentation. For today only, we invite you to use the code WEBCAST365 to receive a membership for just $1 a day. Check out complianceweek.com/membership to learn more. This concludes our webcast. Thanks again for joining us, and goodbye.